The explosion shattered windows for 3 blocks, sending glass cascading like deadly rain onto Market Street. Judge Marcus Washington's coffee mug slipped from his fingers, ceramic shards mixing with blood from a dozen small cuts across his dark hands. The courthouse steps, where moments before Karen Miller had stood screaming into her phone about drug cartels and corrupt judges, now lay buried under twisted metal and concrete dust. "This is dispatch. We have multiple casualties at the Riverside County Courthouse." The radio crackled through the chaos. "All available units respond immediately." Emergency sirens wailed from every direction as first responders raced toward the smoke-filled courthouse square, where Karen's vindictive 911 call had set in motion a chain of events no one could have predicted. 6 hours earlier, Judge Washington had been enjoying his morning routine, reviewing case files in his oak-paneled chambers. At 52, he carried himself with the quiet dignity that had earned him respect throughout the legal community. His appointment to the bench 3 years prior had been met with overwhelming support from both colleagues and citizens who recognized his unwavering commitment to justice. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, illuminating commendations and family photographs that adorned his desk. Karen Miller, 43, and perpetually aggrieved, had other plans for the day. She stood outside the courthouse at 8:30 sharp, her blonde hair pulled back in an aggressive ponytail, designer purse clutched like a weapon. Her manicured fingers drummed impatiently against her phone case as she surveyed the building with calculating eyes. Karen had spent months building her case, not in courtrooms or law books, but in internet forums and conspiracy theory websites that fed her growing paranoia about the changing demographics of her once comfortable suburb. "Somebody has to do something about this corruption," she muttered to herself, pulling out her phone. "Somebody has to make them listen." The morning bustle continued around her as attorneys, clerks, and citizens went about their business, unaware that Karen had spent the previous evening crafting an elaborate fiction designed to destroy Judge Washington's career and reputation. Her motivation wasn't justice or civic duty, but something far more personal and poisonous. At 9:15, Karen dialed 911. Her voice trembled with manufactured urgency as she spoke to the dispatcher. "I need to report serious criminal activity at the courthouse," she began, her words carefully rehearsed. "Judge Marcus Washington is running a drug operation out of his chambers. I've seen the meetings, the money exchanges. He's using his position to protect cartel members, and I have evidence." The dispatcher, trained to take all threats seriously, began asking follow-up questions. Karen had prepared for this, spinning an intricate web of lies about suspicious meetings, unmarked packages, and late-night courthouse activities. She named specific dates, invented conversations, and described fictional surveillance footage that she claimed to possess. "Ma'am, these are very serious allegations," the dispatcher said. "Can you provide your name and location?" "Karen Miller. And I'm standing right outside the courthouse now. You need to send units immediately. There's a meeting scheduled for 10 o'clock. They're planning something big, and if you don't act now, evidence will disappear." Within minutes, patrol cars began converging on the courthouse. Officers cordoned off entrances, questioned staff, and began what would become the most embarrassing and costly wild goose chase in the department's history. Judge Washington, in the middle of reviewing a routine civil case, looked up in confusion as officers knocked on his chamber door. Your Honor, we need to speak with you about some allegations that have been made, Detective Sarah Chen said, her expression apologetic but professional. We're required to investigate all reports of judicial misconduct. Judge Washington set down his reading glasses, his brow furrowing with concern. Of course, Detective. What kind of allegations are we talking about? As Detective Chen explained the accusations, Judge Washington's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to a growing understanding of the racial undercurrents that had likely motivated the false report. He had faced subtle discrimination throughout his career, but nothing quite so brazen and malicious. Detective Chen, I can provide you with complete access to my chambers, my calendar, my financial records, anything you need to verify that these allegations are completely false, he said calmly. However, I'm concerned about the timing and nature of these accusations. They seem designed to disrupt ongoing proceedings. Outside, Karen watched with satisfaction as police vehicles multiplied and courthouse activity ground to a halt. She had successfully thrown the entire judicial system into chaos with a single phone call, and the intoxicating sense of power made her pulse race. What she didn't know was that her actions had attracted the attention of people far more dangerous than local police. Miguel Sanchez sat in a black SUV 3 blocks away, watching the police activity through binoculars. As the head of security for the Hernandez cartel's local operations, he had been monitoring courthouse activities for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to eliminate Judge Washington. The judge's upcoming trial of cartel associates had made him a target, but police presence had made any action too risky. Karen's false report had just solved that problem. The building's crawling with cops, he reported into his phone. Perfect cover for our operation. Nobody will suspect anything beyond the current chaos. The voice on the other end was cold and professional. Execute the plan. Make it look like retaliation for the accusations. The judge becomes a martyr. The trial gets postponed indefinitely, and our people walk free. Miguel ended the call and signaled to his team. 3 vehicles began moving toward predetermined positions around the courthouse, carrying enough explosives to level half the building. The cartel had planned this operation for months, waiting for the right moment to eliminate their judicial obstacle while maintaining plausible deniability. Karen's hysterical phone call had just provided the perfect smokescreen. Inside the courthouse, the investigation was reaching an predictable conclusion. Detective Chen emerged from Judge Washington's chambers, carrying boxes of financial records, appointment calendars, and correspondence that painted a picture of a man whose greatest crime was working too many late nights and caring too much about his community. Your Honor, I want to apologize for this disruption, she said. It's clear that these allegations are baseless, but we have protocols we must follow. Judge Washington nodded graciously. Detective, you were doing your job. My concern isn't with the police response, but with whoever made these false accusations. This kind of behavior undermines public trust in both law enforcement and the judicial system. As the morning investigation wound down, Karen's euphoria began to fade into anxiety. The police response hadn't been as dramatic as she'd hoped, and Judge Washington remained in his chambers, calmly conducting business as usual. Her plan to destroy his reputation was failing, and she began to consider her next move. At 11:45, as the last police units were preparing to leave the courthouse, Miguel's team moved into final positions. The bomb, carefully placed in a maintenance area near the building's foundation, was designed to maximize damage to the structure while creating the appearance of an external attack. Miguel himself had infiltrated the building during the police chaos, posing as a maintenance worker to plant the device in a location that would bring down the southeast corner where Judge Washington's chambers were located. Karen stood across the street, still watching the courthouse with obsessive intensity. She had spent so much time fantasizing about Judge Washington's downfall that she couldn't simply walk away now. Her hatred had consumed rational thought, replacing it with a desperate need to witness his professional destruction. She pulled out her phone again, this time calling the local news station. "This is Karen Miller, and I have a major story for you," she said breathlessly. "There's massive corruption at the courthouse involving Judge Washington and drug cartels. The police just finished investigating, but they're covering it up. You need to send cameras immediately." The news director, skeptical but intrigued by the mention of police activity, dispatched a crew to investigate. Within 20 minutes, a news van pulled up across from the courthouse, its satellite dish extending skyward as the crew prepared for a live report. At 12:03, Miguel pressed the detonator. The explosion erupted from the courthouse foundation like a volcanic eruption, sending a shockwave that shattered windows in a 3-block radius. The southeast corner of the building collapsed in a thunderous roar of concrete and steel, while debris rained down on Market Street like apocalyptic hail. Karen, standing directly across from the blast site, was thrown backward by the concussion, her ears ringing as she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The news crew, positioned perfectly to capture the explosion, began broadcasting live footage of the destruction within seconds. Smoke billowed from the wreckage as emergency sirens wailed from every direction, and Karen watched in horror as her vindictive phone call transformed into a genuine catastrophe. Judge Washington, who had been in his chambers when the bomb detonated, was trapped under debris, but alive. His judicial assistant, Maria Santos, had suffered serious injuries, but was conscious and calling for help. Throughout the building, court staff, attorneys, and visitors struggled to escape through smoke-filled hallways as emergency responders poured into the disaster zone. "This is a disaster beyond anything we've seen in this community," Fire Chief Robert Martinez said during a hastily organized press conference. "We have confirmed casualties, structural damage, and an ongoing investigation into what appears to be a deliberate attack on our judicial system." Karen's world collapsed along with the courthouse. The news van that had been preparing to broadcast her conspiracy theories was now documenting a real tragedy, and she found herself at the center of a federal investigation that would soon connect her false report to the cartel's bombing strategy. FBI agent Lisa Park arrived on scene within 2 hours, her team immediately beginning the complex process of investigating both the bombing and the false police report that had preceded it. Agent Park, a veteran of domestic terrorism cases, recognized the sophisticated planning behind the attack and began mapping connections between various elements of the day's events. "We need to examine the timeline very carefully," she told Detective Chen during their first coordination meeting. "The bombing happened during a police investigation triggered by a false report. That's either an incredible coincidence or part of a larger strategy." Karen, meanwhile, was experiencing the first wave of genuine consequences for her actions. News reports were identifying her as the source of the false police report, and social media was exploding with condemnation of her role in the day's tragedy. Her phone buzzed constantly with angry messages from neighbors, former friends, and complete strangers who held her partially responsible for the courthouse bombing. But Karen's legal troubles were just beginning. As FBI forensic accountants began examining financial records related to the case, they discovered a series of unusual deposits into Karen's bank account over the previous 3 months. The deposits, each under $10,000 to avoid federal reporting requirements, totaled nearly $50,000 and had been transferred from accounts linked to shell companies eventually traced back to the Hernandez cartel. The revelation hit the FBI team like a thunderbolt. Karen Miller wasn't just a racist zealot making false reports. She was a paid operative working to eliminate Judge Washington from an upcoming trial that would have put cartel leaders behind bars for life. Her 911 call hadn't been random hatred, but a calculated move in a larger conspiracy to obstruct justice. The cartel needed Judge Washington off the case. Agent Park explained to her team. His reputation for harsh sentences and refusal to accept plea bargains made him a threat to their organization. They couldn't risk having him oversee the trial of their top lieutenants. The investigation expanded rapidly as FBI agents traced the money trail back through layers of shell companies and offshore accounts. They discovered that Karen had been recruited through online forums where she frequently posted racist rants about Judge Washington and other minority officials. Cartel operatives had identified her as a useful asset, someone whose existing prejudices could be weaponized for their purposes. Miguel Sanchez, meanwhile, had successfully escaped the immediate area after the bombing, but was unaware that FBI surveillance teams had been tracking cartel communications for months. His phone conversations about the operation had been intercepted and recorded, providing prosecutors with clear evidence of the conspiracy. "We have them dead to rights," Agent Park told the U.S. attorney. "Wiretaps, financial records, and physical evidence from the bombing site. This case is going to send a message to every criminal organization that targeting federal judges will result in the full weight of the justice system." 2 weeks after the bombing, as Judge Washington recovered from his injuries in the hospital, federal agents arrested Karen Miller at her suburban home. The arrest, captured by news cameras, showed a woman who had aged years in 14 days. The confident, vindictive person who had made the false 911 call had been replaced by someone who finally understood the magnitude of her actions. "Karen Miller, you are under arrest for conspiracy to murder a federal judge, obstruction of justice, and making false statements to federal investigators," Agent Park announced as she placed handcuffs on Karen's wrists. "You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it." The arrests continued over the following days as FBI raids targeted cartel operations throughout the region. Miguel Sanchez was captured at a safe house near the Mexican border, while cartel leaders found themselves facing federal terrorism charges in addition to their original drug trafficking indictments. Judge Washington, despite his injuries, insisted on returning to the bench as soon as doctors cleared him for duty. His first act was to address the community that had rallied around him during his recovery. Speaking from a temporary courtroom set up in the Civic Center while the courthouse underwent reconstruction. "The attack on our courthouse was an attack on the principles of justice that bind our community together," he said, his voice still hoarse from smoke inhalation. "But terrorism will never prevail over the rule of law. We will rebuild. We will continue our work. And we will ensure that those responsible face the full consequences of their actions. The federal trial that followed became a media sensation, drawing national attention to issues of judicial security and domestic terrorism. Karen Miller, facing life in prison, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed the sophisticated methods cartels were using to identify and recruit assets within local communities. "They found me online," she admitted during her testimony, tears streaming down her face as she faced the cameras and the families of bombing victims. "They played on my prejudices, made me feel important, made me think I was fighting corruption when I was really helping criminals escape justice." The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Financial records showed the cartel payments to Karen. Wiretaps revealed the conspiracy to eliminate Judge Washington, and forensic evidence linked Miguel's team to the bombing. The defense attorneys could only argue for mercy, acknowledging their client's guilt while trying to minimize their sentences. During the sentencing phase, Judge Washington himself took the stand, not as a victim seeking vengeance, but as a jurist explaining the broader implications of attacks on the judicial system. "The defendants didn't just attack me personally," he testified. "They attacked the principle that justice should be blind, that courts should be sanctuaries where truth can be discovered without fear of retaliation. Their actions threatened every citizen who depends on our legal system for protection." The sentences were severe. Miguel Sanchez received life without parole for his role in planning and executing the bombing. Other cartel members received sentences ranging from 25 years to life. Karen Miller, despite her cooperation, was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, a term that reflected both the seriousness of her crimes and the judge's recognition of her manipulation by sophisticated criminal operators. As the trial concluded, Judge Washington addressed the packed courtroom one final time. "This case reminds us that justice requires constant vigilance. We cannot allow hatred, prejudice, or criminal conspiracy to undermine the institutions that protect our democratic society." The bombing investigation led to broader reforms in judicial security and enhanced FBI monitoring of online forums where extremist recruitment occurred. The Justice Department created new programs to protect federal judges and their families, while also educating communities about the tactics used by criminal organizations to recruit local assets. Karen's neighborhood, which had initially sympathized with her complaints about changing demographics, underwent its own transformation. The bombing had shocked residents into recognizing how their casual prejudices could be weaponized by genuinely dangerous criminals. Community groups formed to promote dialogue and understanding, working to heal the divisions that had made their neighbor vulnerable to cartel recruitment. "We all bear some responsibility for what happened," said Margaret Chen, Karen's former next-door neighbor and the organizer of a new community reconciliation group. "We listened to her complaints without challenging them. We let hatred fester when we should have promoted understanding." Judge Washington returned to full duty 6 months after the bombing, presiding over the original cartel trial that had made him a target. With enhanced security measures in place and the conspiracy unraveled, he was able to conduct proceedings without fear of retaliation. The cartel leaders, facing overwhelming evidence and abandoned by their organization, accepted plea agreements that resulted in lengthy prison sentences. The courthouse itself became a symbol of resilience and renewal. The reconstructed building incorporated advanced security features while maintaining its role as an accessible venue for community justice. A memorial garden was established on the site where the bomb had detonated, honoring the victims and serving as a reminder of the price paid for the rule of law. 1 year after the bombing, Judge Washington presided over a special ceremony marking the courthouse reopening. Representatives from across the legal community, law enforcement agencies, and citizen groups gathered to celebrate the restoration of their judicial center. Today we gather not just to dedicate a building, but to reaffirm our commitment to justice, Judge Washington said as he cut the ribbon on the new courthouse steps. The attacks against us were meant to divide and intimidate. Instead, they have strengthened our resolve and united our community around shared values of fairness, equality, and the rule of law. Karen Miller watched the ceremony from her federal prison cell, where she had become a reluctant expert on the consequences of allowing prejudice to override judgment. Her story had become a cautionary tale, studied in law schools and criminal justice programs across the country. An example of how individual hatred could be manipulated by sophisticated criminal enterprises. In her final letter to Judge Washington, written on the anniversary of the bombing, Karen attempted to express the remorse that had taken months to fully develop. "I cannot undo the damage I caused or erase the pain I inflicted on you and your family," she wrote. "I can only hope that my story will prevent others from making the same terrible choices. You showed dignity and grace, even towards someone who tried to destroy you, and that has taught me more about justice than any punishment could." Judge Washington never responded to the letter, but he kept it in his desk drawer as a reminder of the human capacity for both evil and redemption. His experience had taught him that justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoers, but about creating conditions where communities could heal and individuals could choose better paths. The federal investigation spawned by the courthouse bombing ultimately dismantled 3 major cartel operations, resulted in over 200 arrests, and disrupted a nationwide network of corruption that had been targeting judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials. The case became a landmark in the fight against organized crime's attempts to subvert the American justice system. 5 years later, as Judge Washington prepared for retirement, he reflected on the events that had transformed his career and his community. The bombing had been intended to silence him, but it had instead amplified his voice in the fight for judicial independence and community justice. "Evil often contains the seeds of its own destruction," he told the reporters gathered for his retirement announcement. "The criminals who targeted our courthouse thought they could use division and hatred to achieve their goals. Instead, their actions revealed the strength that comes when good people unite around common principles." The courthouse bombing had ended Karen Miller's comfortable suburban life and launched her into a federal prison sentence. But it had also sparked a national conversation about the vulnerabilities in America's justice system and the importance of protecting democratic institutions from criminal manipulation. As Judge Washington cleared out his chambers for the final time, packing away the commendations and family photographs that had survived the bombing, he felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the attack had ultimately strengthened, rather than weakened, the principles he had spent his career defending. The final chapter of the story was still being written in communities across America, where citizens were learning to recognize and resist the tactics used by criminal organizations to exploit social divisions. Karen Miller's false 911 call had been intended to destroy one man's career, but it had instead exposed a vast criminal conspiracy and strengthened the resolve of everyone committed to protecting justice from those who would corrupt it. The courthouse stood rebuilt and renewed, a testament to the resilience of democratic institutions and the power of communities to overcome hatred with understanding, division with unity, and fear with the unwavering commitment to justice for all.